Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shir.
Shalom Aleichem and welcome back to today's Daf Yomi Shabbos Daf Ayin Daled. We're 3 lines from the bottom and Daf Ayin Gimel Amud Beis. Says the Gemara, HaZoyre, HaBoyrer, VaHatoichen VaMarakid. We're referring back to the list of the 39 Avis Malachos mentioned now Mishnah. So, let's say these Samamonim, the ingredients used for dyeing, for coloring the materials, coloring the curtains of the Mishkan, or for that matter, let's say harvesting grain. It went as follows. First they would harvest it, they would go ahead and thresh it, dash, then comes zoyre. They would take this winnow shovel, toss the stalks up in the air, and have the wind come and separate the stalks from the grain. Then comes boirer. They would pick out the psoilus, the unwanted waste, for instance, the pebbles from in between those grains. Then comes toichen, grinding, and then meraket, sifting the flour. Says the Gemara, why this repetition? It would seem that 3 of these activities are merely repetitive. They're all based on the same underlying principle. Winnowing, boirer, and meraket are all basically functioning and doing the same thing. They're separating something which is unwanted from the wanted portion. They're separating the psoilus from the oichel. So why does the Mishnah list them as separate avis malachos? Let's see the Gemara inside. Hainu zoyre, winnowing, hainu boirer, is the same as boirer choosing the pebbles or the waste out of from in between the grains. Hainu meraket, it's identical to sifting. They're all based on the same principle of separating one from the other. So why list them as 3 separate avis malachos? Says the Gemara, Abaye v'Rava d'Amar Tavayu. They both said as follows: Kol milsa d'havei b'Mishkan. Anything, any activity, any malacha that was found in the Mishkan, in the construction of the Mishkan, af agav de'ika, the damila, even if we find something which is so similar to it, chashiv la, we count it. It goes onto our list. So although these 3 activities, zoyre, boirer, and meraket, seem to be so closely related, nevertheless, since they were all 3 found in the Mishkan, we relate to them as independent entities and independent avis malach. Now, as Tosfos points out, they're not exactly identical. They're not exactly repetitious. They're each one is servicing a different purpose, a different function, a different task. There's the winnowing the stalks, which separates the stalks from the grain. There's the boirer, the pebbles, for instance, from the grain. There's the meraket, which is in the flour. They're all 3 different variations of boirer. They're not exactly doing the same thing. Therefore, says Tosfos, since they're somewhat dissimilar, they're different variations of boirer, and in addition to that, they were actually in the Mishkan. That is the reason why they are counted as separate entities and separate avis malachos. Says the Gemara, if that's the case, v'lishav nami kaitish, why don't we also count the malacha of kaitish? Rashi says this is the pounding of the chitim, for instance, the grains of wheat in the kernels of wheat in the machteshes, in the mortar. You pound it in order to remove the klipa, the thin skin that's connected to the kernel. So this is an activity which was found in the Mishkan. Rashi says they used to do it to the Samamonim. So why don't we count this amongst the Lamates Malachos? Now, although it's very similar to dash, the threshing, but we just said that we're not concerned with repeating ourselves, with counting and reckoning with 2 separate types of activity, even though they're so related to each other. We consider them as separate avis malachos since they were found in the Mishkan. So why is kaitish not in our list? Amar Abaye, you're right. Really, kaitish, it should be considered to be an av malacha. Why doesn't the Mishnah list it? Shekein ani oichel pitoi beloy ksisha, because an ani, a pauper, is accustomed to eating his bread without the kernels having undergone this process of ksisha, of pounding to remove its thin skin. And as the Rein Chanama points out, when we speak about ani here, we're referring to the average person. So the average person doesn't do this. It's only something meant for ashirim, for wealthy people. Therefore, this process is not regarded as a significant enough process to be mentioned in our Mishnah. Continues the Gemara, Rav Amar, you know why we don't mention Kaisesh as Av Malacha number 40? Hamani Rebbe, our Mishnah reflects the opinion of Rebbe, the Amar, Avis Malachas Arba'im Chasar Achas. Rebbe learns from the pasuk of Eile Hadvarim that we're meant to only have 39 Avis Malachas. V'yikhashiv Kaitish. If you're going to add Kaisesh, Havale Arba'im, we'll end up with 40. Therefore, you cannot include that in our list. Says the Gemara, is that the problem? Let us remove one of those aforementioned variations of Bayer. We have 3 of them. So, rather than totally ignore Kaisesh and have 3 forms of Bayer mentioned in our Mishnah, let's make a replacement. Let's remove one of those 3 variations of Bayer, and instead substitute it with Kaisesh. In this way, we'll have 2 forms of Bayer and 2 forms of Disha, 2 forms of threshing, rather than having 3 of Bayer and only 1 of Disha. Ella, says the Gemara, that can't be the reason. It can't be a numbers problem. Apparently, the Abaye's approach was the correct one. The reason why we don't mention it is because it's insignificant. Continues the Gemara regarding the Malach of Bayer. Tanur Rabbanan, we learned in the Bryce. One had before him several types of food. Rashi says it was different types of food that were mixed in with some psoila, some waste in there. Taisus actually brings a Yerushalmi, which has a girsa. There's a girsa of Shnei Mine Oichlin, that he had 2 types of Oichlin in front of him, meaning it was something that he wanted, and another form of food which he didn't want. And Taisus brings this girsa, and he says that it's mashma, and the Yerushalmi as well, that this is a form of Bayer, meaning even though there's no actual waste there are 2 edible items in front of him, apples and peaches, and one of them he would like, one of them he doesn't want. So the concept of Bayer applies to this as well, because the one that he would like, that he desires, is considered to be like the Eichel, and the one that he right now does not desire is considered to be like the waste, like the psoilis, and one cannot separate one from the other. So in either case, we're speaking about one who has a situation which would require Bayer, whether it's food mixed with actual waste, which needs to be separated, or 2 forms, 2 variations of 2 types of Eichlin, which need to be separated. Hoy lefan of mine Eichlin. Bayer v'Eichel, he can do Bayer, he can choose and eat. Bayer meniach, he can do Bayer and place before someone else to serve somebody. V'lo yivrer, but he should not do Bayer. V'im birer, but if he did, chayiv chatas. He's chayiv chatas. Says my comment, what's going on here? First we say he can, then we say if he does it, he's chayiv chatas. So the Gemara will give us a list of interpretations, actually 5 approaches to this brayso. Number 1, Amar Ula, Hachik Amar, this is what the brayso means to say. The brayso begins by saying, one can choose, can separate the Eichel from the psoilis, if the intention here is for same day consumption. He can do Bayer to serve somebody if the purpose here is for same day consumption. Why? This is not regarded as a masa Bayer. It's something that's regarded as though he's just preparing the food for the meal. It's regarded as a derech achila. It's like the process of, like the beginning of the eating process. It's not regarded as an activity of Bayer, since it's meant for same day consumption. So that's okay if it's lebabiyim. Ulemachar le'yivrer, and the brayso continues. Don't be Bayer. What is that referring to? If it's lemachar, if he's choosing, if he's separating the eichel from the psoilis to be used tomorrow, in that case he can't do it. V'im birer chayiv chatas. If he should follow through doing that, do Bayer for the sake of tomorrow, that is regarded as a melacha of Bayer and is chayiv chatas. Says the Gemara, Maskevler of Chizda asked, V'chi mutter lefes l'baybayayim. So you maintain that Bayer is allowed if he's going to consume it on that same day. Says Rav Chizda, you can do a malacha if it's for the same day consumption. Can a person bake in order to be used for today? Can somebody cook for today? So apparently Rav Chizda did not see it in the same lens as Ula. He figured there's no difference of whether he's using it today or tomorrow. In either case, it's considered to be a Ma'aser Boyer. Apparently Ula held no. If it's for same day use, that's not your typical Boyer, which is mentioned in the Mishnah. The Melacha Boyer was something meant for storing long term. They would choose the kernels from separate the psoilis from the kernels in order to store them. It's considered to be a long-term melacha, something which is meant to be stored away. It's something enduring. It's not something which is simply meant for same-day consumption. That's regarded as a ma'aseh achila, simply preparing it for consumption. That's not called a melacha of boyer. Rav Chizda disagrees. He says, regardless of what his kavanah is, if he intends on using it today or tomorrow, he's doing a malacha, he's separating good from bad. Can a person cook for today, bake for today? Certainly not. Elam Rav Chizda, you must interpret the brisa differently. The brisa begins by saying, Boyer va'ichel, pachas mikashir. If he does boyer on less than a shear, the shear of malacha is, as we mentioned the other day, the gregorous, the volume of a dried fig. That is considered to be the measure, the shear, the amount. That's considered to be a malach on Shabbos. So if it does boyer to a item which has less than that shear, that's allowed. Explains Taisus why. Because according to Rav Chizda, that is regarded as derech achila. It's a small amount. He's simply trying to. It's like the process of beginning of the process of eating. He's separating simply to eat. It's not considered to be a ma'aser boyer since it's such a small amount. Boyer is only if it relates to a larger amount. And then it's considered as though he's actually accomplishing and creating and cleaning the grains. For instance, for storage, that's called the malacha of boyer. But it's a small amount. That's regarded as derech achila, simply trying to eat it. So that's allowed. If it's pachas mikasher, that's allowed. The brisa continues. Boyer uminiach pachas mikasher. You can do boyer if it's less than a shear, and also serve for the sake of serving somebody else. Ukashir lo yivrer, however, the amount of the shear, he can't do boyer on that. V'imbirer chayiv chatas. That results in a chayiv chatas. Maskav Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef again didn't see eye to eye on this. He says, what's the difference if it's a shear or less than a shear? V'chi mutter lefo ispachas mikashir. Can a person bake less than a shear? Certainly not. Even though he's not chayiv chatas, but as Rashi brings, less than a shear is aser. Aser min ha-Torah. So how can you allow him lechatchila to go ahead and do boyer on an amount that's less than a shear? Elam Rav Yosef, this is the interpretation of the brisa. Boyer va'oichel biyad. The brisa allows one to do boyer with his hands. As Rashi explains, typically boyer takes place with a utensil. For instance, a sieve. It's not something which is done by hand. When a person does boyer by hand, that's not doime, that's not similar to boyer, and therefore that's mutter. Perhaps that's regarded as derech achila. He's simply taking it for the sake of eating. He's not actually doing a malacha since he's merely using his hands. So that's allowed. Once he uses his hands, that's allowed lechatchila. Boyer umaniach biyad. He can do boyer to serve somebody if he does it with his hands. The brisa continues. Bekonoin with a funnel, ubetamcha using this large plate, lo yivrar. He should not do boyer using a utensil, even though it's not your typical utensil used for boyer. That's aser. Now, if he does it, it's not considered to be a melacha and it's chayiv chatas. Nevertheless, that's aser. V'im birer pater v'laser. If he uses this type of utensil for the boyer, he's pater. Ubenafa b'kvara la yivroir. The brisa concludes there is a case where he's chayiv chatas if he uses the proper utensil designated for boyer. Nafa ukvara is a larger a sieve, a sifter that has larger, more coarse, larger holes. So these items are meant for sifting. If he uses them, v'imbirer chayiv chatas. So the brisa concludes with the third stage that nafa v'kvara lo yikvar lo yivra v'imbirer chayiv chatas. We have three stages. Biyad is mutal chatchila. With a kanan and tamchay, which is a utensil, but not the designated utensil, he's not allowed to do that. But he's pater. If he uses the appropriate kli, he's chayiv chatas. Maskal Rav Amnuna. Midi kanan v'tamchay ktani. Where do you find these reference to the kanan and tamchay in the brisa? How can you reinterpret the brisa in this manner? Does the brisa express itself that we're speaking about a kohen v'tamchay? Ela Amar Rav Nuna, the approach is as follows. Boirer v'oichel, oichel m'teich hapsolos. One can manually take out with his hands the oichel from the psolos, as long as he does it in that manner, rather than removing the psolos, the waste from the oichel. He actually goes and picks the oichel from in between the psolos. That's allowed. Boirer umaniach, oichel m'teich hapsolos. He can choose oichel from psolos to place before someone else, to serve somebody. That's allowed because, as Rashi says, loy derech breirahi. This is not the typical masa of breira, which is generally the psolos removed from the oichel. When he does it in the reverse, that's not regarded as breira. Perhaps that's regarded as derech achila. That's allowed the chatchila. Psolos mitoich oichel, however, lo yivrer. He should not choose the psolos from the oichel. V'im birer chayav chatas. So these are the two sides of the coin. If he's taking the oichel from the psolos, that's mutter. The psolos from the oichel is chayav chatas. Maskef le'abaye, midi oichel mitoich hapsolos ketani. How can you interpret the brisa in this manner? Does the brisa make any mention of whether it's oichel from psolos or psolos from oichel? Ela Amar Abaye, this is how we're meant to interpret the brisa. Boirer v'oichel le'alter. One can manually, with his hands, take some food, separate it from the psolos. If it is la'alter, for the sake of immediate use, he's about to eat it. That's not called boirer. Boirer is meant for long term, is meant for storage. But if he intends on eating it right now, that's allowed. Uboirer minech la'alter. He can separate the psolos from the oichel if it is meant for immediate use, even to serve somebody else. However, if it's the same day consumption, if it's not for immediate use, he cannot do breira. V'imbirer, if he did boirer, even if it's for same day use, it is a malacha nasa. It is regarded as though he is keboirer la'oitzer. He is doing boirer for the sake of storage, for long-term storage, and that indeed is the typical fashion of the malacha boirer v'chayiv chatos, and he's liable to chatos. Amru Rabbana kamei de Rav. So the Rabbanan related this interpretation of Abaye in front of Rava. Amar lehu. So he liked it. He said, Shapir Amar Nachmeni. This is how they refer to Abaye as Nachmeni. So Nachmeni, Abaye, said very well. Indeed, this is the right interpretation of the brisa. So in summary, we had a brisa which discussed Allah of boirer, and we have 5 approaches. Ula says, if it is for boi bayoyin, for the same day use, it's mutter. If it's for tomorrow, that is a true malacha, and it's chayv achatas. Rav Chizah says, if it's less than a shear, that's regarded as derech achila. That's not boirer, that's mutter. If it is the amount of a shear, that is a malacha. Rav Yosef says, depends what he's using to do boirer. If he's using his hands, that's mutter. He uses a kanon and a tamchoy, that's aser. He uses a nafan, a kvar, a sieve, that is a malacha and chayv chatas. According to Rav Amnuna, it depends how he did the boirer. If he did the oichel from the psolos, that is mutter. In the reverse, he did the waste from the oichel. He separated the psolos away from the oichel, that is a malacha. According to Abaye, it depends if it's la'alter, if it's for immediate use, then it's mutter. If it's for anything other than immediate use, even for same day use, that is a malacha and is chayav achatas. Now Taisus points out, if all 3 conditions are met, for instance, he's being boirer the oichel from the psolos using his hands, and it is for immediate use, all will agree that's mutter. That's not considered to be boirer. He's not engaged in processing foods. He's simply engaged in eating, and therefore that's not boirer. Continues the Gemara. If one had before him 2 types of foods, ubirer va'achal, ubirer v'hiniach, and he did boirer for his own consumption or for somebody else. Rav Ashi masni potter. Rav Ashi had a brisa which says that he's potter. Apparently it's asur. Rav Yirmiyah medifti masni chayiv. He had a brisa which says chayiv. Says the Gemara, Rav Ashi masni potter. Rav Ashi says it's potter. He has a brisa which indicates that he's not chayiv in this case. V'hatani chayiv. But haven't we learned up at the brisa earlier that he's chayiv? Apparently, it's not really asam d'Rabbanan, and he is exempt, but rather, if a person does proper boirer, he's chayav chatas. Second, Rav Ashi have a brisa which says that he's potter. Says Malay Kash, it's not difficult. It depends what he's using to do the boirer. Ha be'kanin v'tamchay. Rav Ashi is speaking about a case where he uses the funnel or a bowl, it's large, a bowl to do the boirer. That's not your typical utensil appropriate for boirer, therefore it is only Asur Midrabanan. Ha benafa v'kvar. The Brisa which says that boirer is chayav chatas is speaking about a typical case where he uses a nafa ukvara, sieve, a sifter, which is the proper utensil and is considered to be a proper boirer. Continues the Gemara, Ki Asur Rav Dimi Amar. When Rav Dimi came, he said as follows. There was a story. Shabbos de Rav Bibi Havoy. It was the Shabbos of Rav Bibi, his turn to serve the students. V'iklu Rav Amir Ravasi. And Rav Amir Ravasi came to visit. Shoda Kamay. So Rav Bibi, who was serving them, he tossed in front of them, he emptied out in front of them kalkola de peri, a basket of fruit. The fruit were mixed with leaves. So he didn't want to do boirer beforehand. He didn't separate anything. He merely tossed it in front of them. Says Rav Dimi, I'm unsure as to the motive of this conduct. What was the purpose here? Why did he do it in this manner? Why didn't he simply pick out the fruit before serving them? Why did he spill it all out in front of them? Is it because he holds that choosing the oichel from the psoilus is asur? As Taisus points out, he doesn't allow one to choose the oichel before actually serving them. So therefore he tossed it in front of them in this manner. Or was the reason something else? Was it simply out of generosity? He didn't want to skimp, he tossed the whole thing before them. Go ahead, help yourself. So was it a boirer issue? And he held that one is not allowed to be boirer the oichel from the psoilus. And therefore he simply tossed it out in front of them. And as a result, everything got separated from each other. He undid the mixture, he undid the taroivis. There's no more mixture between oichel and psoilus. So, since he didn't actually go ahead and remove the oichel from the psoilus, or the psoilus from the oichel, he merely tossed it out, and the leaves and the fruit became so dispersed that he completely and totally undid the mixture. That's not called boirer. So was that the reason? Or simply out of generosity? He wanted them to have the whole thing before them, and it was simply an expression of ayin yofa, not a halachic consideration. I'm not sure. Continues the Gemara. Chizkiya Amar, another halach. Haboirer turmusim, miteich psela shlehem chayev. Turmusim are these beans which require a long process of cooking, of boiling until they become edible. So if a person goes ahead and chooses, he's boirer the beans from within their psoilus, the skins or whatever it is that the waste there, he's chayev, even though he is choosing oichel from psoilus. Says the Gemara, Leima kasavar Chizkiya. Is that so that Chizkiya maintains that oichel m'sech psoilus asur? If one goes ahead and chooses the oichel from the psoilus, even manually, even if it's for immediate consumption, is that asur? We know that not to be so. This is not a mice of boirer. He's not processing the turmusim. He's merely trying to eat. Says the Gemara, the reason why it's asur here, because turmusim are unique. Why are they unique? Shani turmusim are different than everything else. Why? The shalkele shivazimni. They need lots of cooking. 7 times they would cook it in order to make it edible. Rashi says lamatkan, to sweeten them. Now, once they're so cooked and they're soft and mushy, if he doesn't go ahead and take them, remove these soft beans from between the psoilus and between the shell, the peels there, masrach will get spoiled. Therefore, we regard the removal of the beans from within the waste as though he's removing psoilus from oichel. We don't look at it as though he's removing the oichel from the psoilus. Why? Explain the Mefarshim as follows. Since if he would neglect, he would leave it there as is, the beans would spoil. If so, when he's removing those beans, he's actually benefiting them. He's accomplishing something. He's processing something. He's not really taking something to eat. He's saving it. He's salvaging those beans. He's processing them. If he would just leave them there, they would just spoil within the shells, within the psoilus. That is regarded as a malach of boirer. It's very different than ordinary oichel mesech psoilis when he's simply removing what he wants from in between the waist. It's a derech achila. He's simply taking something to eat. That's not boirer. He's not accomplishing something. He's not processing something. In this case, where the beans in this state after 7 times being cooked, had they been left there in between the psoilis, it would ruin, it would spoil masrach. So the process of removal of the beans from within the psoilis is actually benefiting them, is aiding them. It's considered to be processing. He's accomplishing something. He's processing those beans, and therefore even if he removes the beans, which is the oichel, from the psoilis, we say no, this is regarded as psoilis. But the oichel is as though he's removing the bad from the good, the waste from the food, and it's considered to be an act of processing the food and an act of bitter. Continues the Gemara about toichen, grinding. Omer of Papa. What is an example of hatoichen if one grinds? Haiman de porim silka, if one dices, beats. Rashi says he diced it thin, very thinly. Chayav mishum toichen. He's chayav on account of the melacha of toichen. Omer of Menashe, another example. Haiman de solis, silty. He splinters wood. Chayav mishum toichen. It's regarded as the melacha of toichen, like he's grinding. Omer of Ashi, ikapid amishchasa. If he is cutting the wood down to a specific size, he's makpid on the size. Chayav mishum mechatech. In that case, it is regarded as a melacha of mechatech because it is similar to cutting down the oir, the hides, the skin, the leather of the animal. It is considered to be the melacha of mechatech. Here too, cutting the wood to a specific size has the additional melacha mechatech as well. V'halosh ve'oife. Person needs a dough or bakes. Says the Gemara, 1 second. How did we get to baking here? We're speaking about the melacha is done to the samimonim, to those plants, herbs, ingredients used for coloring, dyeing the materials. That's usually cooked, not baked. Omra Papa. Shavak Tana Didan, Bishul Samimonim. Apparently our Tana abandoned the process of cooking the Samimonim, the Hava Mishkan, that was present in the Mishkan. V'nokat Oife. It seems that he neglected the main issue here. The discussion, the sequence of malachas relating to Samimonim that wasn't the Mishkan, and he chose Oife, which was not part of the process of the Mishkan. Why did he do so? This is a kasha. Amar Papa Shavak Tan Didan Bish Samimonim of a Mishkan v'nokat Oife. How did he do that? Why did he abandon the main discussion and veer off to baking? Says the Gemara, Tana Didan Sidur de Pasnakat. Our Tana chose to elaborate on the process of bread making, which was more common than cooking Samimonim. Therefore, he chose to dwell on that and moved over to Oife, to baking, which was more common. But in reality, Oife, baking, and Mevashal, cooking, are really one and the same malacha. There's really no difference between the two with regards to halacha. Omar of Achabar of Avira. What is an example of Mevashal? Haiman de Shada Sichsal Atuna. A person takes a wooden spike. He wants to harden it, to dry up and harden it. So he throws Shada, he throws Sichsal, this wooden spike, Atuna, into a fire. Chayav Mishum Mevashal. Pshita. That's obvious. Why not? Certainly, he's cooking it up. He's heating it up. Mao the time, perhaps I would think, it's not considered to be Mevashal. Lishruri Monaka Mechaven. He's simply trying to harden it. Lishruri means to harden it. He's hardening this utensil, this mana. His kavanah is not to cook it. He's trying to harden it. Kamash Malon. So he teaches us, no, this is considered to be Mevashal. Why? Because prior to hardening, prior to drying up, what happens? It softens. The mirvarafi. First it softens. When it warms up, it softens, the moisture leaves it. That's a softening process. The hadr kamet, and only afterwards it hardens, it dries up. So that is the melacha of bishul. Softening something hard through heat, through fire, is considered the melacha of bishul. And here too, is chayev because of mevashal. Omar Rabba Barafuna, similar halacha. Haiman da artzach kufra. Person heats up pitch. Chayev mishum mevashal. Pshita, of course, why not? Mao the tame, perhaps I would think, even the hadr v'ikusha. Because after he cooks it up, what happens to the pitch? It hardens. Hadar v'ikusha goes and it results in getting hard. Perhaps I would think to say, that's not mevashal. Once again, mavashal means softening something. Here, the end result is a heart product. Kamash malon. He teaches us, no, this is also regarded as mavashal, since part of the process is softening, loosening up this pitch, is regarded as mavashal. Amar Rava, Haiman de Ovet Chavisa, one who fashions a earthenware barrel. Chayav mishum sheva chatos. There are 7, no less than 7 chatos, which result from this process. There are 7 malachas involved. So we'll take a look at Rashi, who actually lists the 7 different malachas. So that's regarding a chavis. What about the tanura? He fashions an oven. Chayav mishum shmoyne chatos, 8 chatos. Amar Abaye Haiman de Ovet Chalsa. He fashions this reed basket. Chayav achas esrei chatois. This results in 11 karbonis. V'chayti lipume. If he should sew up the rim, the lip, chayav shloish esrei chatois, that will result in 13 karbonis being brought. 13 malachas are involved. Let's take a look at Rashi. So Rashi here is actually 9 lines from the wide lines. So 9 lines on top of where the lines get wide. Rashi begins with the word chavisa. Chavisa shal cheres, of clay, of earthenware. Sheva chatois. If he forms this chavis, this entails 7 malachas. Says Rashi, number 1, toichen haragovim v'sheichten hadik. Grinding the globs of whatever he's using, the earth, the clay, grinding them properly, that's toichen. Have a toichen. Ubayir hatzroiros hagasis misoichen. Then he goes and he picks out the tzroiros, these pebbles. Harish time, here we have the mlach of bayir. Umar kidem benafa. He sifts it in the sifter. Umegabel hatit. And he goes ahead and makes this, he mixes it with water. The hainu losh. Umemareach hatit. Kisha goyim sheichalak. Harim emachik. Then when he makes the goyim, which is the form, he goes ahead and mareach hatit. He smooths out the clay in order for it to be chalak. Harim emachik. This is the malach of emachik. Umaver se'or bekivshon. Umetzarfer b'soichai. He gets the fire going and puts this cheres, this chavis into the oven. Harim mavashel. So he's doing a malach mavashel. Says Rashi, chiyuv the chayfer leker. There's no chiyuv here for the malach of chayfer. The ain't a tzarech al afra, even though he's going and digging out some earth. That's not considered to be chayfer because he's doing it for the sake of the earth that he needs. He has no intent and purpose in actually doing the plowing. Therefore, that is not regarded as the malacha. That's not included in our list. Continues the Rashi. Tanur chayv shmoina. When he makes a tanur, he's liable to 8 chatois. The la'achar shetzarfer bekivshon. Because after he goes ahead and cooks it, bakes it in the oven. By the oven, there's another process. There's another step. Hu tochal of tefela. He goes in and smears another layer of cement, of clay, shehei ob, to thicken the walls, v'choyim miskayim, to insulate the heat. V'ugmar melachtoi. That is considered to be the finishing touch of this utensil. V'ravin and kaman, we learned later on, kol midid avegmar melach, anything which is regarded as the finishing step of the process, chayiv mishumak patish, that is considered the melacha makeh patish. Says Rashi, this malacha makeh patish is not applied to a chavis, because when he places it in the oven, melea nigmara, it finishes on its own. Melea nigmara malachta betaner. The process completes on its own. There's nothing after the baking process. So when he places it in the oven, he indeed is doing a malacha mavashal, but nothing happens after that. It completes on its own. There's no finishing touch taking place. There's no makeh patish. So these are the 2 examples: 7 chatois by the chavis, 8 by the tanur. What about the basket of reeds? Chal, says Rashi, kaver shel kanem, this cylinder-shaped basket made of reeds. If one fashions that on Shabbos, chayev, yud aleph, 11 chatois. So Rashi will list for us the 11 malachis. Zoymer hakanem, number 1, he harvests the kanem, the reeds. So it's a 2-pronged malacha. Because number 1, zoymer hakanem v'utzarech lem chayev shem kaitzer. Since he needs them, he requires these kanem. He's harvesting. He's doing kaitzer. Umishum lateya. In addition to that, he's also being over on the Malacha Neitea because he's pruning the plant. He's enabling further growth. He's spurring further growth. So those are two malachas. Asfam Yachad, he gathers the reeds. Hariz a Ma'amer. Birer Yafais, he chooses the good ones, the quality ones. Hariz a Boirer. Hechlikan, he smooths them out, he sands them down. Hariz a Mamachik. Asan Dakais, if he goes and chops them up. Me'achas, from one reed, he makes 2 or 3 pieces. Hariz a Teichen. It's grinding. Chatchan b'mida. If he cuts them down to size, hariz a Machatich. There's a Malacha Machatich. Heisich HaShesi, if he sets up the horizontal reeds, hariz a Meisich. So he arranges the weaving process. That's called Meisich. Orag achas lamal of achas lamata kedei la'amidai. So initially, when he begins weaving this basket, he goes ahead and he weaves a bit on top and a bit on bottom. He puts a horizontal piece on top, and on bottom he sets up the frame. He sets up the weaving process. That is the malacha hari'oiseh shtei batanirin. When he weaves, oreg, hari'oiseh oireg, that's the malacha of oireg. Chatach la'achar rigosa, kedei la'shvoisam. When he goes in and evens it out, he cuts the protruding reeds. Hari'oiseh makiv patish. That's the final touch of this malacha, of this utensil. Kedar min lekaman, as we say later on, daf ayin hey. Example of finishing touches. Haiman the shokol ekufim iglimi. One who removes the protruding threads of a finished garment. Chayiv mishum makav patish. That is considered to be makav patish. So in total we have 11 malachas. V'chayti lepume. If he should close up the rim, last as a safa to fashion a rim. Hoisef kan toifer v'koisha. In this case we add 2 more malachas: sewing and tying. Shetzorch likshar la'achar hatfira, because when he finishes sewing, he needs to tie together the loose ends of the thread so it doesn't unravel. So we have a total of another 2 malachas, which total 13. Continues the Gemara. Ha'goizes es hatzemem ramalabnei, one who shears the wool and cleans it out, washes it out. Omar Rabba bar Bachana or Yechanan. Ha'toivet semer sha'al gabe behema. If one chooses to spin the wool, make them into threads while it's still on the living animal, while it's still on the behema. B'Shabbos chayiv sholosh chatois. He's chayiv 3 chatois. The Gemara doesn't express that it's speaking about a living animal, but it's on the animal itself. So he does taiva on the animal prior to shearing it, which would be the typical route for shearing, and then eventually he's spinning. He does things in reverse. First he's taiva, he spins the wool on the actual animal. Chayiv sholosh, is chayiv 3 chatois. Why? Achas mishum goizes, shearing the wool. V'achas mishum manapitz, for combing the wool. So he actually combed it prior to spinning it. V'achas mishum taiva, for the malacha of spinning. So 3 malachas involved here, even though it was actually still in the behema. Rav Kana Amar, ein derech gziza b'kach. This is not regarded as a malacha. This is not your ordinary, conventional way of shearing wool, spun wool from an animal. That's not goizes. Vein derech manapitz b'kach. This is not the usual manner, the conventional manner of malacha of manapitz, combing wool, which is generally off the animal. Vein derech tvia b'kach. This is not your typical spinning. Therefore, is regarded as kila achar yad. It's something which is not the ordinary manner, conventional approach to these activities, and it's not regarded as a malacha on Shabbos. Says the Gemara, really? V'loi? V'atanya, haven't we learned? B'shem mishmei d'Rav Chemya. This is regarding the malachas hamishkan, where the pasuk says, V'chol isha chachma slave. They were tavu seizim. They would go ahead and they spun the goats. The goats here on the goats themselves. So we see this is something that's done. So how can you say this is called shaloi kederech? This is not regarded as a malacha. V'atanya mishmei Rav Nechemya. We learned in the name of Rav Nechemya, shatav beizim v'tava beizim. So during the malachas hamishkan, they would wash the goats here on the goats themselves and spin it on the goats. Alma, we see from here, tvia gabe behema shva tvia. Spinning on the actual animal is considered to be a proper spinning. Says the Gemara, being a raya from the Mishkan, the pasuk regards those women as isha chachma, slave, women who were gifted, who were endowed with a greater measure of wisdom. So they would do it in this manner, but the ordinary person would not do it in this manner. Chachma Yesera Shani, individuals who are endowed with Chachma Yesera, additional wisdom, they're different. They do things in this manner, but the ordinary person doesn't perform these malachis while still on the animal. As Taisus points out, based on this Gemara, even a person who is multi-talented, who is able to do this, it would not be considered to be a malacha because batla data mitzvah adam, his das, his intention, his method is nullified compared to everybody else, meaning he's bottled to everybody else. This is not the conventional ordinary manner of doing the malacha, and therefore, even for this person, we would not regard it as a malacha. Continues the Gemara, Tonar Rabbanan, we learned in the Bryce, ha'toilish hakanaf, one who plucks this large feather off the bird, va'koitmai, he snips off the tip, which is soft and can be used for filling, for instance, in a pillow. Va'amarta, he shaves off the hair from the feather. Chayv sholosh chatois. It results in 3 malachas, 3 chatois. Explains the Gemara. What are the 3 malachas? Toilish, plucking it, chayv mishum goizes. That is regarded as a malacha of goizes. Koiteim chayv mishum mechatich. If he goes ahead and he snips off the top, since he's doing it with an exact measure in mind, that is regarded as the malacha mechatich. Me'emarit, if he goes ahead and shaves off the hair, chayev mishum memachik, that is regarded as the malacha of memachik, smoothing it out, and therefore is chayev 3 chatois. So we have toilish, we have koitim, and we have memarit. Continues the Gemara, kosher mater. So these are obvious malachas, tying, untying. Now we need to find it in the Mishkan. Kshira b'Mishkan, where did we find tying in the Mishkan? Amar Rava shekain koshrin b'seidei sahalim, because they would tie down the yiriyos, the curtains, the covering, the material coverings of the Mishkan. They would tie it to the yiseidos ahalim, to the spikes inserted in the ground to maintain stability, to keep those curtains in place. So we see that tying was indeed involved in the Melechas HaMishkan. Says the Gemara, that type of tying, it was something temporary, because as soon as they would leave this location, they would untie this knot, and we know from the Gemara later that it is only a av malacha. When is tying regarded as a malacha? If it is something enduring, something meant to last, but something merely temporary is not a malacha. El Amar Abai says, Abai, where did we find in the Mishkan a kshira which was enduring? Shekein orgi yiriyos, because the weavers of the curtains, of the sheets, of the materials, they would employ tying in their profession. For instance, shenifsek lohen nima, if a thread would snap, so they noticed they snapped a torn thread, they would tie it. They would tie it back together. So this was something enduring, lasting. This is the kshira employed in the Melechas HaMishkan. Amalei Rav, tiras the kosher. Okay, you've addressed the Melech of kosher. Matir ma'ikil amema. Where did you find untying in the Mishkan? V'chitema, perhaps we can apply the concept of matir to a similar scenario. If they found 2 tied threads, badi adadi, aligned with each other, meaning, let's say for instance they encountered this phenomenon 2 times. There were 2 threads that were snapped, and they needed to tie them together. And then when they came to weaving it, as they're weaving, they find, there were actually 2 knots lined up with each other, and it's very noticeable and recognizable. They need to somehow hide the 2 ksharim. So what they would do is, if they found 2 tied chutim aligned next to each other, shari chad v'kater chad, they would undo one of the knots and leave one in place. So they couldn't have 2 knots next to each other. That would protrude, it would be too obvious. So they would be obliged to go ahead and undo one of those knots. And indeed, we find matir in the Mishkan. They would untie a knot. Says the Gemara, cannot be so. That couldn't be their practice. Why? Melech basar v'dam in Kain. This is not something performed even in front of a melech basar v'dam. It's not respectable. They go ahead and they untie, and it would leave a hole there. As Rashi points out, the threads used for the yiriyos were full in shisha. They were 6-fold. They were very thick threads. And if he goes and he unties this knot, it's going to leave a hole there. It's not respectful. In front of a Melech Basav Adam, one wouldn't do this. In front of Hashem, Oisen, do you think they would employ this method? Ella Amarav, Vitema Rabbi Eloi. Where do we find kosher and matir by the Mishkan? In the following manner: Shekein Sodei Chilazon, the trappers of this Chilazon snail, which produced the dye, the tchelas used in the Mishkan. So the trappers who had these nets, kosher and matir, they would untie. If they need to adjust the size of their nets, to remove some of the threads, to add some rope, so they would employ kshira and tfira in their profession. Indeed, we find both in the Mishkan. Continues the more about toifish tfiros. If one sews 2 stitches, that is a malach. Says the more volei kaima. It's not enduring. If he merely inserts the needle twice, he makes 2 stitches. It's going to unravel if he leaves it as is. Amar Rabba bar Rav Chana, Amar Rav Yochanan v'usha kashvan. It's certainly speaking about he tied those loose ends together, and he tied them together, whether it's something else, he tied them in a way that the stitches won't unravel. Indeed, it's called a tfira shel kayam. Hakarei av nas litvar, one who tears, rips, with the intention, with the purpose of preparing a tfira, to enable him to sew. That's called a malach. So merely tearing, ripping for the sake of ripping, that's not a malach, that's makalkal, he's ruining. But if the purpose is to prepare, somehow the tearing is enabling sewing, that is a malach. Says, well, where do we find tearing in the Mishkan? Kriya b'Mishkan mihava? Was there such a concept of ripping in the Mishkan? Rav Zera Damatavai, they both explained, yes, we find it in the following scenario. Sheken Yiriya, Shenafel Bar Darna. If they had a Yiriya, this curtain, this sheet, which were turned up a hole. They find a hole, a darna is actually a worm. So this worm bored a round hole into the Yiriya, into the curtain. Now they need to repair it. Now it's difficult to repair a round hole. It will come out uneven if you just pull together the sides. You have to actually rip it and tear it in a way. You have to enlarge the hole in a way that you can properly mend the sides together. So they will need to actually rip prior to repairing and sewing it back together. Sheken Yiriya, the Yiriya Shenafel Bar Darna, that this worm came to visit and bored this hole. They would have to actually rip it a bit, and mend it afterwards. So indeed we find the concept of Kureya, Amnas Litvar, by the Mishkan. So in summary, the Gemara taught us some descriptions, some details regarding some specific malachas. We discussed the malach of Teichen. If one cuts something into small pieces, chatiches, dakis, thin pieces, for instance beets, or even a piece of wood, that is considered the malach of Teichen. The Gemara told us, why does the Mishnah discuss baking oifa instead of cooking? Because the Mishnah wanted to discuss the bread making process, which is more common. We discussed that the concept of mavashal refers to loosening something through heat. The Gemara describes some examples of fashioning certain utensils that entail many malachis. For instance, the chavis, which has 7 malachis, the taner, which entails 8 malachis, the kaveris, which includes either 11 or 13. We discussed spinning on a behema, that's not called a derech. We discussed plucking this feather, which involves 3 malachis. We discussed the source of the malacha of kosher and mater. We find it by the sayadei chalazin, the chalazin trappers, with their nets. We found the toifer, and toifer is only if he goes ahead and ties up those loose ends to make the stitches enduring and lasting. Where did we find koireya almanas litfar? We found it with the darna, this worm that bored this round hole in the Yiriya, which obliged them to rip a bit to prepare it for mending. Okay, time for a brief chazorah on today's daf. We began discussing the concept of the 39 malachos, how the Mishnah will list even very similar malachos, even if they're based on one underlying principle. For instance, the various forms of boirer, winnowing, and then picking out the psoilas boirer, and then sifting. Why do we list them as separate malachos? Because they were involved in the malachas hamishkan. Therefore, they have their independent significance and chashivas, and they're regarded as separate malachos. the Gemara discussed the reason why koitesh, pounding the chitim in the mortar, is not listed in the list of 30 malachos. Abaye told us because it's not significant. It's not something which is commonly done. An ordinary person doesn't pound his wheat, which he will use for his bread. The Gemara proceeded describing the details of a melacha's boirer. We have a brisa which seems to contradict itself. It begins by allowing boirer and concludes by prohibiting boirer, applying the chi of chatas to boirer. We have no less than 5 approaches to the brisa. Ula tells us the brisa allows boirer, if it is for same-day consumption, is regarded as derech achila. He's merely preparing his food. He's not processing grains or processing foods. He's merely trying to eat. If it's done for tomorrow, that is boirer, and that is a malacha which is chayav chatas. Rav Chizah says if it's less than a shear, it's a small amount. He's merely engaged in his food preparation. It's derech achila. That's mutter. If it is a shear of a volume of a korgeres, of a dried fig, that is considered to be full boirer and is chayav chatas. Risa says depends how he's doing the boirer. If he's manually he's using his hand biyad, that's not called boirer. If he's using a kanain or tamchoy, some sort of utensil, a funnel or a large bowl, that is asr midrabanan, although not really a malacha, since that's not your typical utensil designated for boirer. However, if he uses enough of a kvara, the sieve, the sifter, that is considered to be a proper kli, which results in chayav chatas. Rav Nuna says, depends how he is separating the food from the psailis. If he chooses the oichel from the psailis, once again, that's not boirer. He's simply picking out the food to eat. That's mutter. If he removes the psailis from the oichel, that is regarded as boirer. Abaye tells us, if it is la'alter, if he's choosing if he's separating it for immediate use, that's not regarded as boirer. That once again is regarded as engaged in the food preparation. If it is for same-day use, it's not for immediate use. Even if it's for same-day use, that is regarded as chayav chatas, regarded as a malacha. And as Tosfos points out, all will agree that if he uses his hands biyad and he chooses the oichel from the psailis, and it is for immediate use, that's not regarded as a malacha, because if all three conditions come together, all will agree that's regarded as food preparation, whether it's for himself or whether it's for somebody else. It's not regarded as boirer. As Rav Nuna told us, oichel from psailis is not regarded as boirer. It's regarded as food preparation, whether it's for himself or for somebody else. And therefore, Tosfos says, when we have all 3 conditions coming together, biyad, and it's oichel, and it's la'alter, all shitas will agree that it's mutter. The Gemara proceeded giving us some details regarding some specific malachos. Teichen involves chopping, cutting to fine pieces. Oife is a part of the Sidur, the pas, the bread making process. Mevashal involves softening something through heat. The chaves, the tano, the kaveras that are formed on Shabbos entail many malachas. Doing the malachas on the animal itself is called the shalei kederech. That's not your conventional way of doing the malacha, and that's not chayiv. If one does 3 malachas to the kanaf, it is chayiv chatas, 3 chiyuvim, plucking, chopping it, and removing the hair. We find that kosher mater were employed by the tzayadei chilazin, the trappers, which they would employ to adjust their nets. The Gemara told us that if one sews his teifer, he needs to tie up the loose edges, the loose threads, to have the teifer last and endure. We find kaireya in the Mishkan. When this worm would eat away at the urea and leave a round hole, they would have to rip it away, rip up enlarge the hole a bit, in order for them to be able to properly mend it together to make it unnoticeable.